Chapter 15, the ceremony for the dead. The three questions to focus on here are: why did they, the children, the Egyptians, have a ceremony for the dead? What did they do in the ceremony for the dead? And finally, how do we see the group becoming closer to one another? So we're watching the evolution of these characters, and the characterization starts to reveal that they are more dynamic in nature. Especially we've seen that with April and her evolution in character, not only with friendships, but also with Caroline, her grandmother. The ceremony for the dead. It was Saturday afternoon, and April, Melanie, and Marshall had just come down to get Elizabeth to join the boys in Egypt for a previously scheduled rendezvous. When Elizabeth met them at the door with her dead pet and tears in her eyes, it was only natural that somebody should think of a funeral. And when April and Melanie started tossing the idea back and forth, decorating and elaborating the way they always did, it worked just the way it was supposed to. Elizabeth's tears slowed up, and a damp dimple flickered in her cheek. By the time the three girls and Marshall squeezed through the fence to Egypt, where Ken and Toby were already waiting, a great deal of the necessary background material was already beginning to take shape. Prince Ptahhotep, son of the great Neferbeth, had just fallen in a battle with a terrible monster, and his body was being taken in solemn procession to the temple of Anubis, the god of the dead. Ken and Toby were gratifyingly enthusiastic. In fact, Toby, who always had to be right in the middle of everything, insisted right away that he and Ken, Horemheb, that is, were going to be the high priests of Anubis. Now, just a minute, April said. Melanie and I thought up this ceremony. We get to be the high priestesses of the dead. You mean Aida. You and Aida, Toby corrected. Just the day before, a rule had been passed that members should be called only by their Egyptian names while they were inside the land of Egypt. Okay, me and Aida. Anyway, it was our idea. Yeah, but I've just finished reading a great book that tells all about what they did to the mummies and everything. I've got some tough ideas. So have I, April said. Queen Neferbeth ought to choose the high priest, Melanie said, interrupting the exchange of glares. After all, it's her parakeet. That broke the deadlock. Elizabeth didn't want to decide against anybody, so she put a pebble in one hand and let them choose. Ken and Toby won and got to be the high priests of Anubis. The first thing Toby did as high priest was to announce that the whole thing was going to take a long time. In real Egyptian times, he said, the preparation of the dead and the funeral ceremony took as much as 40 days. Theirs wouldn't take that long, but maybe it would last as much as 5 or 6. He said that before he could really get started, they were going to need a lot of supplies. So until he could get the things he needed, they might just as well go on with the procession to the temple. Melanie suggested that the procession needed palm branches and flower petals and that sort of thing. And of course, everyone thought of the trash bin behind the florist shop. So a few minutes later, the entire population of Egypt was sneaking up the alley on the way to sort over the florist's recent rejects. As soon as they returned, loaded with loot, the procession got underway. Marshall came first, carrying the smoking incense burner. Next came Elizabeth as the queen mother and chief mourner. One of the curtain robes was draped over her head as a veil, and she carried a big bouquet of only slightly wilted dahlias. Then came April and Melanie as the mourning populace, scattering flowers and chanting, "Weep for Prince Ptahhotep, fallen in battle," in a high mournful wail. And last of all came the two high priests of Anubis, carrying on a flower-strewn plank the dead body of the Prince Ptahhotep. The procession wound its way back and forth across the storage yard several times and came to a stop in the temple. There the bier was placed on a specially prepared altar in the middle of the floor. At that point, the ceremony had to stop for fresh ideas. Since this was the first ceremony for the dead, there was no record scroll to follow, and it was necessary to stop now and then for discussion and new suggestions. Afterwards, of course, Melanie would make a record of the things that were done, and any future ceremony for the dead wouldn't have to stop and start. All the other ceremonies and rites had been developed in the same way, but this time there was a difference. This was the first ceremony to be made up since the coming of the two new Egyptians, and the first real ceremony they'd actually taken part in. April and Melanie had often wondered if they ever really would. But they needn't have wondered. The boys took part, all right, and to an extent that nobody had expected. For instance, it was Toby who suggested that they march around the altar, beating their chests and sprinkling their heads with ashes and wailing. That wasn't so much of a surprise. He had already demonstrated that he had lots of good ideas. It was the way he threw himself into the part that came as a shock to the girls. He was so different from what he was at school. At school, he was Toby the cool cat sophisticate. And now, suddenly, he was Toby, the grief-stricken ancient Egyptian. And somehow he gave the feeling there were a lot of other roles he could play just as well. Ken was a different matter, although he, too, did a lot better than anybody would have expected. He was, of course, absolutely perfect at being himself, and he was very much at home in the role. But this Egyptian business was something else again. And so, while Toby staggered around the altar, beating his chest with wild-eyed abandon, sprinkling real ashes left over from Set's sacrificial fire in his hair, and wailing like a wounded electric guitar, and while right behind him April and Melanie did more or less the same things, just about as realistically, except they were using imaginary ashes, because to a girl, even the death of a pharaoh isn't worth a dirty head. And while Elizabeth did everything April and Melanie did, only softer, and while even Marshall marched with solemn assurance, thumping his chest firmly with the hand that wasn't holding security and making a noise like a stuck recording, Ken brought up the rear. If the rest of them could do it, Ken Kamada could, too. And he did. But it wasn't easy. Every time he thumped his chest or made a brief half-hearted wail, he felt his ears get hot. And from time to time, he announced to nobody in particular, "Sheesh, I feel like a kook." When 5:30 came and everyone was leaving, Toby told the other members of the Egypt game to call him up that evening, and he would assign them something to bring. He was going to do some research, he said, to find out exactly what was needed to make a mummy. But there was an awful lot to learn about mummies, and even after a whole evening of study, it turned out that Toby's information wasn't all that complete. For instance, when Ken was assigned to bring oil, wanted to know what kind, Toby couldn't exactly say. It didn't seem likely that the ancient Egyptians used any of the kinds Ken and Toby knew about. Crankcase, sewing machine, polyunsaturated, or bicycle. They finally settled for bicycle because oil was oil, and bicycle was the only kind that Ken owned personally. When the Egyptians had assembled the next afternoon, bringing their offerings of oil and spice and salt and perfume, Toby, Ramos, gave a little talk on how to prepare a mummy. It was a good speech, but it suffered from frequent interruptions because Bastet and Aida had read the same book and had some ideas of their own. And there was another pause while everyone tried to comfort Queen Neferbeth, who got all upset when Ramos spoke indelicately about, quote-unquote, taking out the guts. It turned out that Queen Neferbeth felt so strongly about cutting holes in Petey, even if he was dead, that it was decided to dispense with that part of the procedure. "It'll be all right, Toby, Ramos," Horemheb said. "He's so little he can't have enough guts to make that much difference." Toby was disappointed, but he had to admit that according to the book there was another way. Poor people who couldn't afford the more expensive process had been simply soaked in brine. So the rest of the afternoon was taken up in preparing a salt water bath for Prince Ptahhotep and placing him in it with the proper pomp. There he was left to soak. The appearance of the mummy-to-be when he was removed from his brine bath on the following afternoon was something of a shock to everybody. His wet feathers stuck to his tiny body, and he was covered with a thick, white, salty scum. When Toby lifted him gingerly out of the brine by one claw, everybody felt a little queasy, and Elizabeth's eyes became suspiciously liquid. Toby glanced at her and sighed impatiently. "Now just cool it a minute, Neferbeth," he said. "I'll have 'em all fixed up in 2 seconds. He hastily poured some fresh water over the parakeet and dried him off on the tail of his t-shirt, which was huge and dingy, and probably belonged to his father. When Ptahhotep was dry and his feathers rearranged, he did look almost as good as new, and the mummification process continued. In the next few days he was anointed with spices and perfume, wrapped in thin strips of oil-soaked cloth, and laid to rest with a supply of birdseed and a few of his favorite toys in a smallish pyramid made of old bricks. It was a good week in the land of Egypt, Melanie collected several new ceremonies to add to the sacred records. Ken began to find being an ancient Egyptian a little less embarrassing, and Elizabeth felt so proud of the important part that Petey had played, she almost forgot how much she missed him. But as the Egypt game became second nature to its 6 participants, and they began to feel more and more at home in the land of Egypt, they gradually began to forget about being cautious. Ceremonies, discussions, and arguments began to be carried on in normal or even louder than normal tones, and no one stopped to worry about being overheard. Only one very small Egyptian had an idea that the land of Egypt was being watched, and for some reason, which was his own and private, he didn't choose to tell. The next chapter is the Oracle of Thoth.